Always good to take a little time and just make sure that we come into community with each other, whether you're at home now or here at the center. We often get into trouble with our imagination, but our imagination can also be used positively, like just to sense the community, to be grateful that we have folks to sit with. Those of us who have been doing Buddhist awareness practice for a while understand how challenging it is to not just give in to the habits of distraction and the mind doing what it's conditioned to do, worrying about this, thinking about that, comparing, judging, and all the rest. It's really nice to, in a sense, be in it with others. So whether we can see the other people we're here with or not, just sensing that as we settle into our experience of the sitting body, making the adjustments that are helpful. Perhaps you'd like to take a couple of longer, deeper breaths, where we take the time to fill and empty the lungs a few times. Learning that we don't have to rush. And even this opening ritual of taking a couple of longer, deeper breaths can be done in a way where the heart touches into this pleasure of simplicity. Just this, just the taking the time and feeling what it feels like to slowly fill the lungs and then to slowly empty the lungs. Doing this simple activity with our whole heart, whole presence, not holding back. Letting something simple be worthy of wholeheartedness. Eventually allowing the breathing to continue on its own. So we're not particularly trying to make it this way or that way, but instead we trust the body to breathe. And taking some time now, opening to hearing. And again, we're just going to practice saying yes to the experience of hearing, to receptivity, keeping the experience of hearing in mind. And of course, the mind is naturally sensitive to hearing, but we do need to make the effort to keep the experience of hearing in mind. So it's the effort of not forgetting hearing. And see if you can get interested in the continuity of keeping hearing in mind and subtle pleasure of that non-distractedness. Cultivating a sense of patience and forgiveness with those habits of distraction, getting caught up in thought or just forgetting, keeping hearing in mind. Just beginning again. Let it be a fun, enjoyable exercise, almost a sense of humor about the habits of distraction, not getting frustrated, just beginning again. And we're allowing every other experience to be there in the periphery, but we're choosing to be interested, choosing to keep in mind the experience of hearing and the subtle pleasure of that wholeness of attention, that non-distraction with hearing. To whatever degree we can sense that pleasure. And all the little and bigger ways that the mind gets seduced into thinking something else is worthy of attention, even though we had resolved just to be open and receptive to the experience of hearing. We're letting this be the most important thing. and seeing if we can, this peace of seclusion, the mind secluded from whatever else it would be doing, because it's choosing to keep in mind the simple experience of hearing. And noticing how the interest, the alertness needs to be renewed moment by moment by moment. Can't do this on autopilot. And the particular effort is the effort to be interested in the present moment by using this neutral or ordinary experience of hearing. So we're keeping the experience of hearing in mind. And we're choosing to be authentically interested in what is probably ordinary. But the continuity of present moment awareness isn't ordinary. It's healing and it's pleasurable, this non-distraction. And maybe surprisingly, it takes a lot of courage because we're willing to let everything else fall, sometimes far into the background or periphery. And we're choosing to be just interested in hearing this relatively simple, ordinary experience of hearing sound. So by default, the rest of the world is released. We're not worrying, we're not planning, we're not comparing. We're learning to abide, to trust, being intimate, open to hearing, and letting that be enough. Let's continue in silence for some time. Be willing to begin again and again in a relaxed but persistent way. Notice how it's really just the effort to remember that hearing is happening. You don't need to make the effort to try to hear, because hearing is already happening. We just need to remember that it's happening. Keep it in mind. We're specifically learning that it's possible to drop the mind's attraction to the diversity of our experience by training the mind to be interested in something simple like hearing. It's so simple because hearing is already happening. And we're just asking the mind to remember that hearing is happening. Just as a little experiment to see what that sets in motion. Give it time. So we're also learning to persist. And in these last couple minutes, whenever we have a little momentum or a little continuity, keeping hearing in mind, and just sensing what's not here, all the mental proliferation or thoughts about this or that, just noticing all of that absence. The mind is empty of so many problems because it's simply hearing being known. And finally, just see if you can sense that quality of wholeness or completeness. Hearing is being known. And there's something inclusive in that. We're not excluding anything, even though the mind is interested in the hearing that's being known. Nothing's excluded. So we're sensing that openness. Nothing having to be left out. And maybe even a sense of well-being. Take a little time, listen to your body, adjust, stretch, whatever you need. And for all of you online, I'll show you our wonderful in-house community, if that's okay. You can say hello with your eyes and your waves if you want. And thanks again for joining in. It's nice to be here subbing for Shelley, who's teaching on the West Coast at Cloud Mountain Retreat Center between Seattle and Portland, Oregon, but in Washington State, leading with a few others the young adult retreat, the annual young adult retreat that Shelley has been teaching for a number of years now. And Shelley will be back leading the half-day retreat this Saturday, if you're interested, Saturday afternoon, 1 to 5. And while I'm doing announcements, I'll just mention Niels Heyman, a wonderful teacher of ours who we don't see as much because he's now living in Australia. He'll be teaching tomorrow night, online and in person. Wonderful teacher, 7 to 8:30. I'll lead the loving kindness practice group a week from Friday. And several of us are leading a practice period at the retreat center the 11th through the 15th of this month. And Corey's doing the annual work retreat out at the retreat center the last 2 weeks of July. So that's coming up. If you're interested in any of that, you could just contact the office. So what'd you think about that particular training? I'm sure it pushed a few people's buttons, or a lot of our minds at least. They don't like to be told what to do. But it's nice actually to be willing to take up some of these trainings and not to think that in any way that's the only training. But we learn, something like the mind, which is, not so easy to understand, like what the mind is, to understand the nature of the mind. The way we learn about the mind is we ask it to do things. And in a way, the mind begins to reveal its nature when we ask it to do stuff. Like, honey, would you be willing to be interested in the experience of hearing? Would you be willing to sustain this interest? And then what happens? Like what gets in the way of that sustaining? And what happens when the mind does sustain that simple interest? And like I said during the guided instructions, it's not like you or I were doing the hearing, right? We were recognized that hearing was happening. But we can fall into that wrong understanding that I'm hearing. I'm hearing the sounds in the room, like the blower here for those of you in person. We've got a relatively loud furnace blower that just circulates the air in the room. And maybe some traffic sounds and a few other things, but the dominant sound is just the blower. And it can feel, like a burden. Oh, I got to keep listening to the sound of the blower. But hearing the sound of the blower is happening, right? And those of you at home, whatever sounds in your space, whatever they are. So it's that very particular effort to be interested in the present moment, to connect, and we're basically choosing to use something convenient like the sensitivity to sound to be in the service of that desire to connect, to be intimate. Because the alternative is that the conceptualizing or conceiving mind will conceive what the present moment is and will think that thought, connect with that thought, but we won't be aware that it's just a thought. We'll be what in Buddhism we would call deluded, thinking something is something that it's not. So we often use these simple training mechanisms to break the spell of habit. That's why it's hard. Anybody find it hard? Yeah. Well, it might be nice just to hear from some folks. People here in the room, if you don't mind, if you want to share, I can repeat what you say. But especially if you're going to say a few things, you might want to sit on the bench and I'll hand you the mic, and that way people online can hear you. And people online, you can just raise your hand digitally, or if you don't know how to do that, just go ahead and unmute yourselves. and I'll put my PA mic to the speaker of the computer, and that way everybody here in the room will hear what you have to say. But it might be nice just for us to normalize what is it like to undertake that training for 30, 35 minutes or whatever we did it for. What did you learn? What was hard? What felt good about it? Or just questions that you have about it too. And I'll respond to any of those questions. Anybody feel like unpacking your experience a little for the group? What did you learn? What was hard? What was interesting? Yeah, please, Eric, do you mind coming up? So I'm not going to turn the camera for those of you in the room just because we're recording this for the YouTube channel, but your voice will be recorded, not your image.
So, interestingly, normally when I am sitting here and I get lost, I use the sound of the blower to come back and say, okay, am I being aware? I'm aware of the blower. I'm aware of the sound of the blower. And yet when I was instructed to just pay attention to the hearing of the sound of the blower, I found that suddenly difficult.
So what's that about that sustaining? Because I think it's really the sustaining, because I'm guessing most of us, if the mind was invited appropriately, most of our minds would be willing for a moment to recognize hearings happening, right? So that I think for most of us, the problem arises with this invitation really to keep hearing in mind, to not forget, which is really goes right to the essence of what we mean by awareness, mindful awareness, sati. It's keeping the present moment in mind, that that hearing is being known. Like that's what we're keeping in mind, that hearing is being known. Hearing is being known. And you see, it's the reason it's so difficult is the mind is in the habit of generating, constructing meaning and doing stuff and doing whatever, basically following the momentum of habit. And so now we're asking it we're not telling it don't do that, but in a way the no, don't do that happens because we're saying yes, do this. Keep the hearing in mind, keep the hearing in mind. And so it has to release the other habits that it has because we're asking it to do something. And so what that reveals is the force of habit that normally governs the mind, but we don't really see that force of habit until we ask the mind to do something like keep hearing in mind. Then, and maybe only then, you could do it other ways, of course, we really see, oh yeah, the mind has we say a will of its own. But basically what we're saying is there are habit energies governing this mind. Whatever the mind is, it's being governed or it's being affected by habits. To think this, to do that, to compare, to imagine, to fantasize, to think this is stupid, all the different things that the mind is inclined to do. Yeah, other thoughts? Online, here in the room? What else you learned? Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, so my name is Rob, and I notice, even after practicing this for over a decade, how easily and how susceptible I am to distraction and fantasizing and doing anything other than concentrating on what I'm doing. Sitting here quietly is easy, but the consistency of mindfulness is a very, very difficult practice. Thank you.
And one thing that we can talk about together tonight and reflect on together is, because appropriately we don't want to turn our practice into some war, like good versus evil, because we we do that a lot, and we sort of know how unhelpful that can be. But just because that sort of dualistic good versus evil isn't going to help, it doesn't mean that we're not training the mind. Right? The practice isn't just to come to a place like Common Ground or join in online to program and then just let the mind do what it's inclined to do. Because then we're just basically reinforcing whatever those tendencies are in the mind. So the whole point of the teachings and the community and having a place, whether it's on Zoom or the physical space here, having teachers and teachings, the whole point is to create the supporting causes to train the mind, to retrain the mind. So it's not going to just keep doing what it's been already trained to do. So we're reconditioning the mind. And basically, the way we say that, or might describe that, is from our habits of distractedness to the newer habits of being present with things just as they are. And so we should expect there to be, appropriately, some pushback, some sparks, some resistance. It's not a war. I mean, we'll turn it into war over and over again, and then we'll realize that doesn't help. But it is a training. And the real art is like, how can I do this training? How can I persist at the training? And either we're going to simply be reinforcing the habits that are already habits, or we're going to be doing the more challenging work of establishing a new habit. It's kind of like those are our two choices. Doing the same thing and getting the same result, or creatively, one way or another, using skillful means, which basically means using whatever works or whatever helps, we're remembering, right? You were using the force of remembering what the new habit is, that the new habit we want to train in, like remembering to recognize the present moment. And in this case tonight, we were using the ordinary experience of hearing to help keep the present moment in mind, because hearing happens in the present moment. Yeah, other thoughts that come to mind, other experiences that you learned, and then, what Rob mentioned, which is so common, is that just recognizing the force of habit. It's just did frustration arise? How did the mind relate to the frustration? Because there's something about that, like, whatever arises, just keep remembering. Well, is there still hearing? Yeah, hearing's being known. Right? We don't always have to, like, something might arise and it looks like a big problem, like I'm really frustrated and I really believe I'm not good at this. But we might not need to address that. We might just realize, yeah, that's there. And look at, hearing's here too. Yeah, Anne, please. And then we'll go to the two folks online, Erica and Jessica.
Hearing is difficult for me. It is something that of my senses. It's, there are people who can really repeat tones, and I'm not one of them. And I'm highly kinesthetic, and sometimes I think I have a merging of senses, so it's very difficult for me to separate senses. So I receive most hearing through my sense of touch. So I hear sound touching my body. So, I guess there's such a palpable feeling of receiving my senses through my sense of touch. But I just can't do it separate. That's one question about what is that, and is that just sloppiness in terms of it, or is that there's just some merging of senses? And the other one is I kept hearing otherworldly music that seemed to be coming out of there, and I wondered, and then when words or songs arose, glory, glory, hallelujah, I would go back to sounds in the room, but there were lots of sounds in me that weren't just worldly sounds. So those are my questions.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Yeah, but really, it's all of that, none of that sort of matters, right? Because hearing's hearing, whether it's something that we might call internal or something that we might consider external. If it's hearing, it's hearing. Because remember, it's not about the hearing, it's about being intimate with the present moment, with the way it is. And we're using hearing as a convenience, as a skillful means to not be lost in thought, let's say, just to kind of make it simple. So whatever that activity is, and whether it's blended with other senses, especially the tactile sense, that's okay, right? Because is it here and now? Is it something being known here and now? Is it related to the experience of hearing? Yeah. And then you can ask yourself, like, is this something the mind is thinking up, or, you know, whether it's visual or language-based or whatever it is, which is fine as long as then it's recognized. Oh, so it's just this, I got lost in thought or whatever. And yeah, hearing's here. Because hearing doesn't go away. It's always here and now. And it's always like this thing of blending is just in some ways an insight, because it's artificial, like to imagine that the experience of hearing exists in a compartment that's isolated from everything else. You know, it's just not the way it is, right? Some people have the strength of attention that in being aware of the hearing so specifically, they're literally not aware of anything else because of that strength of attention, right? But that was not part of the instructions, right? The instruction was just to keep hearing in mind. And even at the end, I mentioned, like, to notice there's a wholeness to that, right? An inclusive quality. And that's related to that sense of well-being that comes, not because of hearing, but because of more being grounded more in the continuity of the present moment, being less and less somewhere else, in a fragmented, in a state where that is affected by greed and aversion. Because most of our thinking about things and being lost in thought is being shaped by even if it's subtle, the force of greed and aversion. The dramas in our mind are affected, the activities affected or driven by greed and aversion. Let me turn to somebody online. Erica, do you want to go next? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I rarely, if ever, attune to hearing during my meditation. I usually attune to the breath. So one of the things that really I noticed was that when asked to focus or remember hearing, because it was novel, presumably, I brought much more attention and awareness to that practice and experienced less distraction than I do when I focus on the breath. So I started thinking in hindsight that focusing on the breath, because it's become routine, I just slip into a half focus and, aren't really as aware and attentive. And so distraction and other things become much more prominent. So just being asked to do this, really that point of comparison with what usually happens in my breath focus meditation was just really instructive for me to see the difference there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing with us, Erica. Yeah, that's why it's good to mix it up, because everything just, it's just the way our mind works. Things become routine. And there's just something seemingly built in to how we are that, and it makes sense. I'm sure it's been developed through the evolutionary process that when the system can do something on autopilot, it's going to do it on autopilot. Because it just leaves more bandwidth for other things, And but although it might be useful in an evolutionary sense, like survival sense, it's not necessarily helpful in an awakening sense. Because awakening is not the same as survival. We're really trying to understand, and there's a kind of penetrating power that comes with the continuity of presence. It's like the secrets of the mind, the secrets of the present moment, the way it is, can't stay hidden when there's that non-judging and relaxed, persistent curiosity about the way it is, about what's being known. It's like everything is revealed in the space of the present moment if the mind is persistent enough. So we just start to see what hasn't been seen as clearly before. And it doesn't have to do, like Erica's saying, it was the freshness that made the difference, not that someone could have done the opposite, like really have been working for many years with the hearing, and then some teacher, or for some reason, they really bring their attention to the breath, and they would have been able to say the same thing that Erica said, like, yeah, I just saw a lot more than I normally see. I had a lot more continuity, right? A lot more momentum and that stability of awareness. Thanks for sharing, Erica. And Ruth, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciated this exercise. For me, the effort of sustaining focus on sound and the challenge of that reminded me a bit of when you're falling asleep while watching like a movie or a TV show and you so badly want to pay attention, but then you keep falling asleep, and that was kind of like the forgetting. And that effort, you're trying so hard to stay awake and watch it, but you keep drifting off. It was really familiar to me. And the particular type of forgetting I noticed myself engaging in was like analyzing the sound. So, for example, at one point I was hearing like the hum of my computer and some bird sounds, and then I was like, ooh, epiphany moment. Are these sounds really separate? Like, where does one sound end and the other begin? And then before you know it, I'm like philosophizing about the sensations, And so I was still in a way focused on the sound, but not so much the sensation, which I think might have been what we were intended to focus on rather than thinking about sound. So in those moments of forgetting, I found it really helpful. I found the direction to just remember really helpful. I think that direction kept me from shaming myself or feeling like I was doing it wrong, because forgetting is such a natural, automatic thing. So when I just thought to myself, like, oh, remember to listen to the actual sound, it was easy to ease back in to attending to that. And it didn't feel forceful, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that direction.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate that sharing. And I think it has a lot to do with the heart has to learn to trust what's really, really, really simple. And that's not easy, because culturally, and I think just maybe the way things have been structured in our minds, we generally have reverence to things that have more complexity and a kind of rejection or mistrust, interestingly, of things that are simple. Because I don't know if anybody felt this at any point during the sitting time, where the instruction was just to keep remembering that hearing is happening and is being known. Did anybody have a sense of like loss or death, even, to be maybe a little bit more dramatic, bit like the heart or the mind is losing something of real significance. Like because I'm choosing to be interested or to keep in mind that hearing is being known, there's something of real value that's being lost, or something of real value that's ending. Anybody have that felt or sense about that? Because it is a loss of a kind, right? Something is disappearing. I mean, basically whatever else the mind would be doing is ceasing, because the mind is doing this. It's being intimate with, the remembering hearing. Hearing is happening. Hearing's being known. Other thoughts that come to mind, experiences that people might want to share? And you might sense already, what we're talking about tonight it's not the only skill by any means that we're learning, but it's a really essential skill, which is this recognition of viveka, is the Pali word for dispassion, seclusion, and it relates to how the mind, its relationship to sensuality, to sense experience, and the mind's relationship to thoughts about sense experience, and the mind's relationship even to the sense of a me who has existence in sense experience. So dispassion or seclusion is like realizing that fixation on sense experience, the actual sense experience like hearing, and the diversity of our sense experience, and our thoughts about sense experience, and even the sense of a me who has sense experience, that the mind can let that go. That whole obsession or fixation or interest can be abandoned for a period of time. And then the interesting spiritual question, well, what is that like when the mind chooses? Because that's what we were doing with hearing. There was so much of sensuality that we were choosing not to be interested in because we were choosing to be interested in hearing. So we were choosing to not be that attentive to our thoughts about other experiences, nor to the other experiences that were showing up in the moment, right? And so there was a lot of letting go, a lot of dispassion about all that other stuff that the mind wasn't attending to. And that's what generally, especially when we get a little momentum, that's what is generally experienced subjectively as well-being. Well-being is more about what's not there. The mind not having to attend to all of that diversity of sensuality, of sense experience, because initially it's just being with this one aspect, the meditation object, let's say. Other thoughts, comments, questions that come to mind about that? Yeah, Kermit, and then we'll go to you next. You want to come up front? Appreciate people willing to be here. It's just for the online community, it just makes it better to hear it from your own voice.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. My name is Kermit. One of the things that still amazes me is that after years of being somewhat diligent about doing this, it's so easy to just nod off, just conk out. And I did that tonight. And I know it's because I think it's because I'm just following a thought and wandering off with it. But I will snap out of it and I'll wake up and I'll say to myself, oh, that's just what the mind does. And kind of not make a problem out of it. Just let it kind of do what it's doing and I'm able to sort of ignore it and turn into I use the the nada, the inner listening thing, and then I'm fine. So that happens to me a lot. So anyway.
I'm sure people appreciated hearing that. And, this is not a joke. What's the difference between someone who's just been practicing a year and somebody, like myself, who's been practicing now for more than 40 years, is that it's not that distraction doesn't happen, but the mind is not going to make a problem out of the wandering, right? There's a way to just realizing, as soon as like I'm talking now just from my own experience tonight, not just theoretically, but actually what was going on while we were practicing together, and the mind would wander. And then in that moment of noticing that the mind is wandering, the mind would realize that hearing is right there, right, like the distraction, whatever that was, some more seductive than others, right? But whatever the distraction is, wisdom has that capacity to see what else is here. Oh yeah, hearing is here. So that insight that Kermit's talking about, because I really think it is an insight, is it's like how wisdom understands distraction. And there are more skillful and less skillful ways to understand what distraction is. And a skillful way of understanding distraction is a way of understanding distraction that's not distracting. And an unskillful way of understanding distraction is the mind recognizes distraction in a way that is interrupting, that separates the mind from the present moment. The mind gets some bubble because of the distraction and what the mind takes the distraction to be. You see how that could be such a powerful insight that in a funny way, we never know distraction, right? Because as soon as there's awareness, it's not a distraction. And wisdom can really get that. If I'm aware, then this isn't a distraction. And if I'm aware, then whatever the meditation object is, whatever I'm supposed to be paying attention to, it's got to be here, because this is the present moment. Oh yeah, there's hearing, right here. And it's just to see that for ourselves, it really makes the practice seamless. And it doesn't mean the mind didn't get distracted. And when we're distracted, then the mind is unaware. So it can't practice. So in a sense, the mind's off the hook because it's distracted. And then there's an awareness of distraction and a non-reactivity, because there's wisdom that understands this is being known and everything else is right here anyway. Whatever else that might be recognized has to be here, because this is the present moment where everything is. Oh yeah, here it is, hearing. Hearing's being known. Yeah, thanks, Kermit, for that. Yeah, I don't know your name. James. James? Yeah. Come on up, if you're willing.
My name is Jay, and I think that Mark just answered the question or the thing that I've mulling over, but I'll bring it up anyway. I was trying to reconcile the internal music versus the internal dialogue that I have. And you may have just answered that with what is distracting and what is not. If I were to hear music while I'm trying to listen to the air blower, I think that would be distracting, and probably maybe as distracting as the thoughts that I wrestle with. So that was just kind of the thought there, but I just thought it was an interesting thing that, perhaps there are internal things we can hear that are not problematic.
Yeah, and that's basically just a good assumption anyway, that nothing is problematic. Because the present moment, this is an insight, right? That the present moment is always inclusive. And I know that the teachings can be a little confusing about this, like one sense gate versus another sense gate. But the here and now, like, yeah, the idea is so compelling that this isn't right. And so it might be better to like replace that idea that doubts, thinks that I'm doing something wrong. It might be good to train the mind to have like a replacement might be, could this be right? Or could this be okay? Like just that basic presumption instead of, oh, this isn't right. Because that's very compelling, and in different ways, we all have that habit. It's certain, probably more in some places in our life than in other places, where that doubt comes in, where we just feel like we're doing something wrong. And, this is like related to our patterns of shame and other heavy states for us. And it's really nice in this practice. Like sometimes I say it this way, and I'm not sure the best way to articulate it, but one way I'll say it is you can't break it. Like our practice, awareness practice, you can't break it. You can't really screw it up. Oh, I've so screwed up. But it really feels that way. Like I even now, I'll have that, like, I'll catch myself having like gotten lost during a meditation period, gotten lost in thought, like seemingly a billion miles away from the present moment. And then come, awareness comes back online. And then this very compelling thought, like, I've totally ruined this set. Might as well pack it in and get on with my day, or something like that. And it's so compelling. It's like, to kind of turn this into something worthwhile isn't worth the effort. And it's really good to just have a counterweight to that, like, yeah, this is okay. It's totally okay. For a long time, I don't do it as much now, but for a long time when I was teaching and even in my own practice, I would just use that phrase, can this be okay? And, for some people that can be a little triggering, but it just has to be asked as a real open question, not a sort of forcing something to be true, but just like, well, can this moment be okay? Because what the heart, this sort of intuition or wisdom in the heart might understand is, it's not a question about the absolute nature of this moment, like, is it okay or is it not okay? It's really a more pragmatic question. Is it skillful to relate to this moment as if it's okay? It's really that pragmatic question. Like, if I relate to the moment as if it's not okay, what does that set in motion? If I relate to this moment as if it's okay, like what I'm doing, what I'm experiencing, that it's not okay versus it's okay, which of those two is onward leading to more learning and more ease? And that's the way that's the pragmatism that the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings are really grounded in. It's totally about being, functional in the sense of retraining the mind, the heart, to be unfolding in a way that's in the direction of release, as opposed to in a way that's in the direction of tension. Anne, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yes. My name is Anne. I guess I had a question. I practiced with anchors like the breath and sound and even sensations in the body. And then sometimes I'll practice with like just kind of an open awareness. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts or your own practice of like, how do you go back and forth between them? Like if my mind is really busy, I'll find like, okay, focusing on the sound feels really good, but then sometimes it'll be too like tense and I'll need to like relax back and like not focus on anything. And sometimes I'll go back and forth throughout a sit doing that. So just curious if any thoughts about like what is helpful with using anchors and using open awareness, and like, does it just depend on the day, or kind of how do you use that in your own practice or have used that?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. It's a really good question. And again, I think it's just pragmatic. So we need to have some sense of where we want to go, right? Aspiration. And the aspiration is like the heart in the direction of release, the heart, the unbinding of whatever feels tight or bound up. What is in the, and seemingly, because we're sort of feeling our way around, what seems to be in the direction of the unbinding, the releasing, the putting down of what can be put down, as opposed to what is onward leading to getting bound up or being just sort of in a floaty place where nothing's being learned. And sometimes we switch things around because we're averse or because we're greedy. And then we want to notice that, because that's not onward leading, like to be under the spell of like, if I really, I'm going to go to, a more concrete anchor, and I'm going to really dig in, and I'm going to get somewhere once and for all in my practice. And then we'll notice what that sets in motion. Or this is too hard, I'm going to back off. And then what, and is that aversion or is that wisdom? And then we just, it doesn't matter what you do. Like you might sort of give yourself a slap on the wrist. No, you're sticking with this. Or you might say, yeah, let's back off and do a more open awareness practice. But whatever the choice is, then just observe what that sets in motion, whether it helps or not. Because a lot of times, you'll get different answers from different people, but ultimately, there's no way around this. You have to become independent in assessing whether what you're doing is onward leading or not. And it's, we don't want that responsibility. We, and a lot of us at least, really want some wise spiritual parent, to tell us what to do. And, and then we just follow this wise thing, and then we get wherever we think we want to go. But it just doesn't work that way, because we have to develop our own independence and intuition about the aspiration. Like we're pure, part of what we're doing in our practice is we're purifying what we think the heart, what's available for our heart. Like, what do we mean by ease or release or peace or freedom, right? Because initially it's just sort of, they're just words. But then over time, there's some intuition about like the peace, the release, the unbinding, like what that experience is and what might actually be available, like a way of being. And then that helps us, like having some sense of the aspiration, intuitive and independent, then helps us understand like, what's the mind doing now? How's the mind relating? And is it in that direction or not? Or am I just following habit, doing more of the same, getting the same? Or am I in a skillful way supporting this, moving in the direction of this aspiration? It's like, which the example that's used a lot is when you're hiking in the mountains, you don't always have a clear line to the peak, But every once in a while, you get a little clarity and you go, that's where I'm going. I'm going to climb that mountain. And then you're in the woods or you're in a canyon or whatever, but you don't really, you have a sense maybe where it is, but you don't know. But we want to have a sense, like each step is in the direction of that place I want to go. But we don't always have a clear line, where we have confidence. But that's what we're feeling, about those choices. And part of it is a sense of, oh yeah, this is onward leading to what the heart truly desires, that dropping of what's extra. But equally, we develop intuition what's not in that direction. This seems to be in the direction of somebody like me wanting to get rid of something, or wanting to become somebody, or wanting to get something, right? And so then that just raises interest, like, oh, is this suffering? Is this extra? Because when we're aware of that greed or that aversion, then the awareness of that greed and aversion isn't the greed and aversion. Then we're back practicing again. There's some relief, like as soon as we realize I'm trying too hard, it's already a relief to realize you're trying too hard in your practice, isn't it? Or that you've been complacent and just sort of going through the motions. And, like Rob was mentioning, it's very common when, like, we might have some momentum, and then in a way the mind indulges in the tranquility, and it can get into that really dull state, that sleepy state, because it's no longer interested in practicing. It wants to make a bed of the practice, the tranquility that has shown up. And then just that, like, oh, this is nice, but is it onward leading? Because the tranquility, the wisdom sense is like, I can't count on it. Things will change, like the sit will end, and then whatever nice feeling, that will be gone. But it's not like you have to abandon nice feeling. It's really about just being interested in it. I meant to say that in your comment, after your comment, Rob, like when we do get some nice tranquility or just a sense of inner peace, it's not like it's dangerous to feel good feelings, pleasant feelings. It's just that we want that real, vivid, intimate presence. Oh yeah, this inner well-being, this tranquility is like this. It's being known right here. And that's going to happen anyway, like even with the mindfulness of hearing that we did tonight, if we got a little momentum, so there was that well-being, because the mind wasn't getting pushed around by the diversity of our experience, and just the simplicity was experienced as tranquility, then we need to keep the tranquility in mind even as we're hearing, because it's associated with the continuity of hearing is that well-being of simplicity, of non-distraction. We have time for one or two more reflections. If there are any other thoughts that come to mind, learnings or questions, even experiences that you've had in the past where you've gotten a little continuity of present moment awareness and what that was like. It's nice to have those testimonials from other voices in the room. Yeah, Jessica, please.
Hi. Hearing is it's an interesting practice for me, because I think when I first started out, it was sort of a relief from the anxiety that would arise as I was paying too much attention to the breath, I guess. And so there was something that was really nice about having this sort of like bath of just noise that would come through, or just sound that would come through. And I think at some point I think it was Michelle McDonald did a meditation where she was really talking about being receptive to sound, and can we wait for the sound of like the bell to come and to impact the sense, as opposed to sort of be on it like that's a bell and sort of cut it short. And so that's something that I've been playing with, because the tendency is so much like to put that, listen to the sound, really have a veneer of thinking over it, where like it's sort of like sensation and the like knowing of what it is, kind of, and like sort of it's sort of like it takes the sensation out of it a little bit. Does that make sense? And like sort of starts being thinking in there. So anyway, it slips back and forth, I think, a little bit. I'm just wondering if you have something to say about that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. And it reminds me a little bit of what Erica said earlier in the conversation, because here in this room, our predominant sound was the blower, which is a little bit like what Kermit mentioned, the inner sound, the nada sound. Nada is a word that's sometimes a Sanskrit Pali word that just refers to that inner hum background sound that some people hear. And but when you're in a more like outside or in your space at home, you might have had other more specific distinct sounds. And then you get that phenomena that Jessica was talking about, where we see a lot of that nature, the conditioned or habit nature of the mind, to either lean in almost as if it's going to grab a hold, sound, or take a hold of the perception. When the mind recognizes what that sound is, there we can detect a kind of hunger in the perceptual process, like the way the mind recognizes the sound, like it's a little like greedy, or almost like you're playing a contest and you want to beat the other people to recognize that sound. And then what else is there? And all of that sort of energy, which wisdom is going to recognize as a little off, a little tight, a little not needed. Like Jessica mentioned, with some practice, like if we don't react to that hungry, even aggressive underlying, in a subtle way, underlying nature or habit of the mind, if we just observe it without turning it into a personal problem, then we might recognize that how unnecessary it is, because that's what really causes those unnecessary habits to go away. And I, for one, and I bet I'm not alone with this, had this problem with mindfulness of breathing. How many of us, when we took up the training to be aware of the inhalation and aware of the exhalation, did we notice how hard it was just to receive the experience of breathing in and just to receive the experience of breathing out without the deep habit of needing to manipulate the breath or get tight about the breath? Or it's not easy to just observe or be aware of the breath coming in and the breath going out. There's just that. But that kind of thing that, let's just call it extra, and it's really the animating force of greed and aversion, but in this case at a very subtle level. But we need to see it. That's a more subtle insight into dukkha. It's the pervasiveness of dukkha, that whatever it is that the mind is knowing, that triggers a subtle greed and aversion. And even a subtle ignorance, like ignoring what's neutral and getting spellbound by what's pleasant and being aversive with what's unpleasant. And it's so incessant. And it can break open a deeper kind of compassion, like where we have a more honest sense of what dukkha is, what sense existence, existence with sense experience is. It's oppressive. And it's not about being nihilistic, it's about being realistic. Oh, this is what it's like. And no wonder the mind seeks out distraction, because without distraction, we're more likely to sense this kind of pervasive tension in how the mind relates to sense experience. It's got to ignore the neutral stuff because it's neutral. It's got to like the pleasant stuff because it's pleasant. It's got to want to get rid of the unpleasant stuff because it's unpleasant. And that reflexive conditioning is oppressive. And wisdom will see it. And then that clarifies the aspiration. Like, oh, that's what the Buddha means by release. And that lines up with what my heart deeply desires. It wants release from this oppressiveness, this being bound up with our likes and dislikes. So we have to leave it here. It's 9:00. Really appreciate all the great comments and questions that people brought up. Felt like a nice conversation. Let's just take a few seconds, just enough time for maybe 2 or 3 breaths together, and let go the words. And thanks again, everyone. So nice to be here together. Have a nice week.